Ancient human warship. One mistake, taunting the force that destroyed a galactic fleet. Part 1. The Relic Awakens. The Kerith Nebula was not a place anyone went by choice. It was a graveyard. Everyone in the galaxy knew that. Broken ships floated in its thick purple clouds, like old bones left behind after a long-forgotten war. The gases were too dense for clean navigation. The radiation was just enough to mess with sensors and make pilots nervous. Most fleets gave it a wide path. Most captains marked it on their charts with a simple warning, "Do not enter," and moved on without a second thought. Admiral Tejo had entered it anyway. He stood at the front of the bridge of the Coalition cruiser KSV Halrin, arms folded behind his back, eyes fixed on the wide viewport ahead. The nebula outside was thick and slow-moving, deep purple and dark blue, lit from within by the faint glow of dead stars. It was almost beautiful, if you forgot what was buried inside it. He had not come here by choice either. 3 hours ago, the Halrin had picked up a signal. Not a distress call. It was too old and too weak for that. It was more like a heartbeat. Something deep inside the nebula was still alive, still running, still sending out a quiet pulse on a frequency that had not been used in over 800 years. Tejo's communication officer had flagged it immediately, and the moment Tejo saw the frequency code on his screen, he felt something cold move through his chest. That frequency belonged to a human vessel, not a modern human vessel. The current human fleets used entirely different communication bands. This frequency was old, First Era old. It came from a time when humanity had just pushed out into the stars and was still learning what the galaxy was. The ships they built back then were rough, heavy things. Big reactors, thick armor, weapons that were more brute force than precision. The other species in the galaxy had found those early human ships almost funny. Primitive, they called them. Clumsy. Tejo had studied enough history to know that was a mistake, even back then. He had brought the Halrin in slowly, along with 2 escort ships, the Dayun and the Sailori, and now they were deep enough in the nebula that the signal was coming through clearly on all screens. Lieutenant Yuna, his science officer, stood at her station, with both hands moving fast over her console, pulling up data and cross-checking it against the Coalition's historical records. "I have a match," she said, without looking up. Her voice was calm, but her hands had stopped moving. That was how Tejo always knew she had found something serious. She went still. "The signal origin is a vessel designated UNSS Resolute. Human construction. First expansion era. Hull class. Unknown. It was listed as destroyed in the Verath Corridor engagement approximately 830 years ago." "Listed as destroyed," Tejo repeated. "Listed," Yuna said, "not confirmed." That distinction sat heavily in the room. The bridge crew were quiet. Everyone was looking at their screens. But no one was really looking at their screens. They were all listening. Even the soft hum of the Halrin's engines seemed to get quieter, as if the ship itself was paying attention. Tejo turned to his helmsman. "Take us in closer. Half speed. Keep all sensors running." The Halrin moved forward, and the nebula parted slowly around the bow. The clouds shifted and rolled, and then out of the dark purple haze, the Resolute came into view. It was enormous. That was the first thing that hit Tejo, the sheer size of it. Modern warships were built lean and fast, designed for quick jumps and precision strikes. The Resolute was nothing like that. It was wide and heavy, built like something meant to take punishment and keep going. Its hull was dark gray, almost black in the low light of the nebula, and it was covered in damage, long scars where weapons had cut across the plating, sections of armor that had been melted and then cooled into rough, uneven shapes, entire sections of the outer hull that were simply gone, exposing the dark skeleton of the ship's frame underneath. And yet it was still here, 800 years in a radiation-soaked nebula, and it was still here. Power readings? Tejo asked. Yuna checked her screen. Low. Very low, but present. The reactor is still running. Barely, but running. Life support is offline. No biological signs aboard. But the ship's core systems are active. Something is keeping it on. Commander Rena stepped forward from the diplomatic section of the bridge. She was the Coalition's senior liaison officer, responsible for communications and first contact situations. She was sharp, experienced, and had dealt with more complicated situations than most officers twice her age. She looked at the Resolute on the viewport with the expression of someone who had just found an interesting piece of furniture at a market. It is an old ship, she said. A very old, very broken old ship. She tilted her head slightly. How is it still transmitting? Automated systems, Yuna said. The ship's AI is still running on minimal power. It has been maintaining the signal on a passive loop. It is essentially just announcing its location. Rena looked at the wreck for a moment longer. Then she let out a short, quiet laugh. Not a mean laugh, just the kind of laugh that comes when something seems more absurd than threatening. 800 years, she said. Sitting in a nebula all by itself, talking to no one. She shook her head. Humanity builds strange things. Tejo did not laugh. He was still looking at the ship. He was looking at the size of it, at the way it sat in the nebula. Not drifting, he realized. Not drifting. The Resolute was holding a stable position. After 800 years, with a reactor running on almost nothing, it was still holding a stable position. That was not an accident. That was not a dying ship. That was a ship that had been told to stay somewhere, and was still following that order. Yuna, he said quietly. What class did you say the hull was? Unknown, she said. It does not match any hull classification in our records for first expansion era vessels. Run a deeper check. Go into the restricted Coalition archives if you have to. Yuna nodded and turned back to her console. Something about it made the back of his neck feel tight. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize something in that room is watching you, even though nothing in the room has moved. The Resolute had not moved. Its systems had not changed. The signal was still the same quiet, steady pulse it had been since they arrived. But Tejo could not shake the feeling that the moment Rena had laughed, something aboard that old ship had noticed. He did not say that out loud. He just watched the ship and waited for Yuna's results, and kept his arms folded behind his back, and said nothing at all. Outside the viewport, the nebula drifted slow and quiet, and the Resolute sat in the dark, like it had always been there, and like it planned to be there, for a very long time still. Ancient human warship. One mistake, taunting the force that destroyed a galactic fleet. Part 2. The Taunt. News traveled fast in the galaxy. That had always been true. It did not matter how far apart the star systems were, or how deep into contested space something happened. The moment a ship sent a report, the moment a crew member passed a message to a contact, the moment a communication buoy picked up a stray signal, the information was moving, spreading, finding its way into the ears and databases of people and governments that had no business knowing about it, and yet, somehow, always did. The discovery of the UNSS Resolute in the Kerith Nebula was the kind of story that spread faster than most. By the time Admiral Tejo had finished his initial survey and filed his preliminary report with Coalition High Command, the information had already leaked. He did not know how, it never mattered how. Someone on one of his ships had talked to someone who had talked to someone else, and within 18 hours the story was circulating on every major galactic communications network between the Outer Rim and the core systems. Ancient human warship found intact in Kerith Nebula. 800 years old, still running. The reactions were mostly what Tejo expected. curiosity from the scientific community, questions from historians, a few political statements from the Human Representative Council, careful and measured, saying only that the matter was being reviewed. The coalition's own press office sent him a message asking for a full report as soon as possible, with the word urgent written 3 times at the top. But the reaction that Tejo had not expected, or rather, the reaction he had hoped would not come, arrived 22 hours after the story broke. It came from the Vorath Empire. The Vorath were not a species that sent quiet, careful diplomatic messages. They were a species that sent statements, declarations. They believed in making their position loud and clear at all times, because in their culture, silence was a form of weakness, and subtlety was something you used only when you were not strong enough to speak directly. They had built their empire on that philosophy, and it had served them well enough. 43 star systems under their control, a military fleet that had not lost a major engagement in over 200 years. The engagement that had truly made their reputation was the destruction of the Serath Galactic Fleet. The Serath had been a significant power once, a loose alliance of 7 species who had pooled their military resources into a combined fleet of roughly 400 warships. It had taken decades to build. It had been considered one of the strongest defensive forces in the Outer Quadrant. The Vorath had destroyed it in a single campaign cycle. Not defeated, destroyed. When it was over, there were no ships left to surrender, no admirals left to negotiate, and no one left who had not understood exactly what the Vorath Empire was capable of. That had been 60 years ago, and no one had seriously challenged them since. So when the Vorath Empire issued a public statement about the Resolute, Tejo read it carefully and felt the tightness in the back of his neck return. The statement was not threatening exactly. It was worse than that. It was dismissive. The Vorath sector commander, a decorated warlord named Kovath, had personally recorded a short broadcast that was sent on an open channel, meaning every ship and station in the sector could receive it. In the broadcast, Kovath stood at the front of his own command bridge, looking relaxed and almost bored, and he spoke about the Resolute the way someone speaks about a thing they have already decided does not matter. A piece of old scrap that should have been melted down centuries ago. He said that humanity had a habit of holding on to things long past their usefulness, and that this ship was proof of that habit. He said that the Coalition's interest in the vessel was typical of organizations that mistook age for value and rust for strength. He said it with a small smile on his face, the kind of smile that is designed to let the other person know they are being looked down on. And then he announced that the Vorath Empire was dispatching a patrol wing to the Kerith Nebula to assess the situation directly. On the Halrin, Tejo watched the broadcast twice. Then he called Yuna to the bridge. "Have you finished the deep archive search?" he asked. Yuna placed a data tablet on his console. Her face was the same careful, professional expression she always wore, but her eyes were doing something else. Something that looked like she was working hard, not to show what she was actually thinking. "I finished it an hour ago," she said. "I was deciding how to report it." "Report it now." Yuna took a breath. The Resolute does not appear in any standard hull classification, because it was never given one publicly. It was a classified build. The designation in the restricted archive is Siege-class Apex vessel. There were 3 ever constructed. The other 2 were officially decommissioned and destroyed after the first expansion era ended. She paused. The Resolute was listed as destroyed in combat. The archive entry for it is sealed with a first expansion era military code that our system cannot break. "What does that mean?" Tejo asked. "It means someone, 800 years ago, decided that the information about this ship was too sensitive to leave accessible." Yuna looked at him steadily. "Ships do not get sealed records because they are ordinary, Admiral." Tejo looked at the data tablet for a long moment. On the viewport, the Resolute was still visible in the distance, still sitting in its stable position, still sending out its quiet, steady signal. "What is the Vorath Patrol Wing's estimated arrival time?" he asked. 14 hours, his navigation officer Do-hyun answered from his station across the bridge. 14 hours. Tae-ho leaned back slightly in his chair and thought about that. Meanwhile, deep in the Resolute, in a core processing unit that had been running on minimum power for over 8 centuries, the ship's AI, designation Han, had been listening to everything. It had no crew. It had no orders that covered this specific situation. But it had a full record of the open-channel broadcast from Vorath Sector Commander Kovath. It had logged the tone. It had logged the content. It had catalogued the broadcast as a direct verbal challenge issued toward a vessel of the human military. And it had a response protocol for that. Han did not respond immediately. It did not send a message. It did not power up its systems or do anything that would be visible on any sensor screen on any ship in the area. It simply began to calculate. In the slow, cold dark of the nebula, the Resolute sat exactly as it had for 800 years, unchanged, unmoving, patient, and something behind its scarred and blackened hull began very quietly to wake up. Ancient human warship. One mistake, taunting the force that destroyed a galactic fleet. Part 3. What sleeps inside? The first sign came from the sensors. Do-hyun noticed it 6 hours before the Vorath patrol wing was due to arrive. He was running a standard passive scan on the Resolute, something he had been doing every 30 minutes since they found the ship, logging the readings in case they changed. And on this particular scan, something was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of change that made alarms go off or brought people running across the bridge. It was subtle. A small, almost invisible shift in the power output reading coming from the old warship's reactor core. It had gone up. Not by much. Barely enough to register. But it was consistent. The same measured increase. Steady and deliberate, like someone slowly turning up the heat under a pot of water. Do-hyun stared at the reading for about 10 seconds. Then he called Yuna over. Yuna looked at the data, compared it to the previous logs, and then did what she always did when she found something she did not immediately have an answer for. She went very still and very quiet. Her eyes moved across the screen carefully, checking every number twice. "How long has it been increasing?" she asked. "The change started approximately 4 hours ago," Do-hyun said. "It is small enough that the automated alert system did not flag it. I only caught it on the manual comparison." Yuna pulled up the full timeline on a wider screen. The increase was clearly visible once you laid the numbers side by side. A slow, measured climb that had started not long after the Vorath broadcast had been received in the nebula's communication range. She noted the timing. She noted it very carefully. "Tell the Admiral," she said. Tae-ho came to the sensor station and looked at the data without saying anything for a long moment. Then he asked the question that was already forming in everyone's mind. "Is this automatic? Could it be a normal reactor fluctuation after receiving a signal?" "It could be," Yuna said honestly, "except that it is not fluctuating. It is not random. It is a controlled, incremental increase. Something is managing this output deliberately." She brought up a second set of readings alongside the first. "And there is more. These are the ship's internal system scans, the ones we have been running passively since arrival. Look at this section." She pointed to a cluster of readings near the center of the ship's internal layout. "Those are the ship's secondary processing cores," she continued. "They were completely inactive when we arrived. 11 hours ago, 3 of them came online. 6 hours ago, 2 more activated. In the last 4 hours, the rest have followed one by one." She let that sit for a moment. The ship's AI is not just maintaining a passive signal anymore. It is running full active calculations. Taeho looked at the data for a long time. Chief Engineer Soi had been quiet on the far side of the bridge, going through a separate archive search that Taeho had quietly asked her to run the night before. She was the most thorough person on his crew, methodical, patient, and deeply uncomfortable with leaving any stone unturned. She stood up from her station now and walked to the main console, carrying a datapad with both hands. "I found something in the old human military archives," she said. Her voice was steady, but the way she held the datapad, tight with both hands, said something else. The Siege-class Apex vessel program was a classified human military project developed in the final decade of the first expansion era. 3 ships were built. Their purpose, as stated in the restricted archive, was, and I am reading this exactly, terminal theater denial. Taeho looked at her. "What does that mean?" Soi looked up from the pad. "It means these ships were not built to win battles. They were built to end them permanently." The design philosophy behind the Siege class was that if a conflict reached a certain scale, if a conventional military response was no longer sufficient, you did not send in more ships, you sent in one of these. She placed the datapad on the console and slid it toward Taeho. "The weapon systems are not detailed in the archive. They are listed only as classified. Authorization level, First Expansion Military Council only. The tactical protocols are the same. Everything about what this ship can actually do is behind a seal we cannot open." The bridge was very quiet. Taeho picked up the datapad and read through the archive entry himself. It was short, shorter than it should have been for a program of this scale, which told him that most of the information had been deliberately removed or hidden elsewhere. What remained was just enough to confirm what Soyi had said. 3 ships, built for a purpose so extreme that the program had been shut down and the record sealed when the political climate changed. The other 2 ships had been decommissioned and destroyed. The Resolute had been listed as lost in combat. Listed, not confirmed. He set the pad down and looked at the viewport. The Resolute was still sitting in its position in the nebula, unchanged on the outside. The same broken hull, the same dark, scarred armor plating, the same quiet, steady presence it had maintained for 800 years. But the numbers on Do-Yoon's screen were still climbing. Slow, steady, patient. "It is responding to the Vorath broadcast," Taeho said. It was not a question. "The timing matches," Yuna confirmed. "And it has not done anything aggressive. No weapon signals. No targeting data. No, nothing outward." Yuna paused. "It is just preparing." Rena came forward from her station at the back of the bridge. She had been quiet since Taeho had shown her the archive entry earlier that morning, and the easy, dismissive confidence she had carried when she first saw the Resolute was completely gone now. In its place was something more careful, more attentive. "We should contact the Vorat patrol wing," she said. "Tell them what we know. Advise them to hold position outside the nebula." "And say what exactly?" "That a 800-year-old wreck with no crew is powering up because their commander made a public broadcast mocking it?" Rena opened her mouth, then closed it. Taeho turned back to the viewport. He thought about the archive entry. He thought about the phrase, terminal theater denial, about what it meant to build a ship specifically for situations where conventional responses had already failed. He thought about the fact that the Resolute had been sitting in this nebula for 800 years without drifting, without shutting down, without simply dying the way dead ships were supposed to die. He thought about what kind of AI had been built into a ship like that, what kind of parameters it had been given, what it had been designed to do when certain conditions were met. Then from Do-Hyun's station, a new alert sounded, quiet and short. "The Resolute just sent a transmission," Do-Hyun said. "Almost careful. on the same open channel as the Vorath broadcast. Everyone on the bridge turned toward him. Do-hyun looked up from his screen. "One word," he said. "Acknowledged." The bridge stayed silent for a long moment after that. Outside the viewport, the Resolute sat in the dark of the nebula, exactly as it always had. But Taeho knew, and everyone on that bridge knew, that something behind that ruined ancient hull had just drawn a line in the dark. And somewhere, 14 hours away and closing fast, the Vorath patrol wing did not know what was waiting for them. Ancient human warship. One mistake, taunting the force that destroyed a galactic fleet. Part 4. One mistake, eternal consequence. The Vorath patrol wing arrived in the Kerith Nebula at exactly the estimated time. 7 ships. That was what Do-hyun reported when the first contact appeared on his long-range sensors. 7 ships, moving in a tight combat formation. 3 in front, 2 on each flank. The kind of positioning that said, "We are not here for a conversation." They were Vorath Hunter-class vessels, mid-sized and well-armed, each one built for speed and aggressive engagement. They had been the standard patrol unit of the Vorath Empire for decades, the same type of ship that had torn through the outer edges of the Serath Galactic Fleet in the opening hours of that campaign 60 years ago. 7 of them, against one 800-year-old wreck with no crew. Taeho watched the sensor screen from his chair on the Halran's bridge and said nothing. He had tried, twice, to send a message to the Vorath wing commander on a private channel. Both times, the response had been the same, a short automatic acknowledgement that the message had been received, followed by nothing. No reply, no change in course. The Vorath were not interested in what the coalition had to say. They had made their decision before they entered the nebula. Rena stood at her station, with her hands clasped tightly together, watching the sensor screen. She had not said much in the past several hours, since the Resolute had sent its single-word transmission. She had been quieter than Taeho had ever seen her. The easy confidence she normally carried was still gone, replaced by something that looked, if he was being honest with himself, a great deal like dread. On the main sensor screen, the Vorath formation moved deeper into the nebula. They were moving directly toward the Resolute. The Resolute did not move. Its power output had continued climbing through the night, still slow, still controlled. But by the time the Vorath wing reached sensor range of the old warship, the numbers on Do-hyun's screen were significantly higher than they had been when all this started. Not dramatically, not the kind of power surge you would expect from a ship powering up its weapons in a hurry. It was still that same measured, deliberate climb, like a fighter settling into a stance before a fight. No rush, no urgency, just readiness. Soi was watching the technical readings from her station and narrating them quietly to Taeho. Power has reached approximately 62% of estimated reactor capacity. Secondary systems are fully online. I am reading activation sequences in sections of the ship I could not identify last night. They do not match any standard weapon system layout in our database. She paused. There is a lot of the ship we still cannot see into clearly. The hull is blocking detailed internal scans. That, Taeho thought, was probably by design. The Vorath wing stopped about 8 kilometers from the Resolute. On the open channel, the wing commander, not Kovath himself, but one of his officers, issued a broadcast. He identified the patrol wing. He stated that the Resolute was in contested space and subject to Vorath Imperial authority. He gave what he called a final warning, though his tone made clear he did not expect it to be necessary. The Resolute was a dead ship. Everyone knew that. Then, he ordered his ships to open fire. The first volley hit the Resolute across the port side, a heavy burst of energy rounds that would have torn through the hull of a standard warship and left it venting atmosphere into space. The rounds hit the Resolute's armor plating, and the explosion was significant, bright, and clearly visible on the Halran sensors from their position further back in the nebula. The Resolute took the hit, and then it turned. That was the moment Taeho felt the cold move through him again. The same cold from the first day, when he had realized the ship was holding a stable position on purpose. The Resolute turned with a slow, heavy precision that should not have been possible for a ship that size, running on the power levels it had been showing even an hour ago. It turned like a ship that had been ready to turn, like a ship that had been waiting for exactly this. The Vorath wing fired again. 3 ships this time, coordinated, heavier rounds. The Resolute moved. Not fast. It was too large for fast. But it moved with an absolute certainty of purpose that made every other piece of ship movement Taeho had ever watched look clumsy by comparison. It angled itself to take the second volley across the thickest section of its forward armor. The impact scattering across the plating in a bright spreading burst of fire that lit up the nebula for a full second before going dark. Then the Resolute responded. Taeho had been expecting weapons fire. He had been expecting something large and loud, a broadside, an energy cannon, something that matched the scale of the ship. What he saw instead was something he did not have a word for at first. Do-hyun was calling out readings from his sensor screen in a voice that was trying very hard to stay professional, and mostly failing, describing energy signatures and targeting patterns that were not matching any weapon type in the Coalition's database. What the Resolute fired was not one thing. It was a sequence, fast, precise, each shot or burst or field or whatever it was, arriving at a different angle, targeting different parts of different ships simultaneously, in an order that seemed almost casual, like Han had done the math on all 7 ships at once, and was simply working through the list. The first Vorath ship lost power in under 30 seconds. Not destroyed, just stopped. Every system on it went dark at the same time, as if something had reached inside it and switched it off. The second ship tried to move out of range. The Resolute tracked it, without any apparent effort, and hit it with something that sheared off its entire engine array in a single precise strike, leaving it dead in space, but otherwise intact. The third and fourth ships fired everything they had in a coordinated burst, a desperate, heavy volley that would have been enough to crack the hull of any ship Taeho had ever encountered. The Resolute took it head-on. The explosions were enormous. The nebula around the ship lit up like a small sun for a moment, bright enough that the Halrin's external cameras automatically dimmed to compensate. When the light cleared, the Resolute was still there, still moving, still tracking. Do-hyun's voice dropped to almost nothing. "It is fine," he said. It is fine." The armor held. The remaining 3 Vorath ships broke formation. 2 of them tried to run for the edge of the nebula. The third turned and made an aggressive charge, a desperation move, the kind of thing you do when you have nothing left to lose. The Resolute handled all 3 in under 4 minutes. It was not brutal. That was what struck Taeho the most about it, watching it happen. There was no rage in it, no excess. Every action was exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger. The 2 ships running for the nebula edge were stopped, not destroyed, stopped, by targeted strikes that took out their navigation and propulsion in sequence. The charging ship was deflected by something Soy could not identify at all, a field or a force of some kind, that redirected its momentum and left it spinning slowly in the nebula clouds, intact, its crew alive and presumably terrified but unhurt. When it was over, 7 Vorath Hunter-class vessels were floating in the Kerith Nebula. All of them were completely unable to move. The Resolute returned to its position. Its power output began, slowly and steadily, to drop back toward the levels it had been holding before the engagement. The same measured, controlled decrease, patient, deliberate. On the Halrin's bridge, no one spoke. Taeho realized after a moment that his hands were gripping the armrests of his chair, and he deliberately unclenched them. He looked around the bridge at his crew. Do-hyun was sitting very still at his station, staring at his screen. Soi had her hands flat on her console. Yuna was standing with her arms at her sides, looking at the viewport. Rena had sat down at some point during the engagement. She was looking at her hands. Taeho looked back at the viewport, at the Resolute, at the 7 disabled Vorath ships scattered around it, like toys left on a floor. At the slow, dark clouds of the nebula, drifting past all of them, unconcerned, the way the nebula had been drifting for 1,000,000 years before any of them had been born. He thought about the archive entry. Terminal theater denial. He thought about the sealed records. He thought about the word that had been sent on an open channel the night before, acknowledged, and about what it meant that the ship had said only that, and nothing more, and then simply done exactly what it said it would. He was quiet for a long time. Then, very quietly, Rena said, "I laughed." Taeho looked at her. She was still looking at her hands. "When we first saw it, I laughed." She paused. "I said humanity builds strange things." Taeho did not say anything. Outside the viewport, the Resolute sat in the dark, exactly where it had always been, and waited for whatever came next. Ancient human warship. One mistake, taunting the force that destroyed a galactic fleet. Part 5. The message left behind. For a long time after the engagement ended, the Kereth Nebula was silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when nothing is going on, the kind that happens when something has just finished going on, and the world has not yet decided what to do next. The 7 Vorath ships floated in their scattered positions, dark and powerless, their crews alive, but unable to do anything except sit in the quiet and wait for rescue. The Halran and its 2 escort ships held their distance, sensors running, nobody speaking above a necessary word. And the Resolute sat exactly where it had always sat, power dropping slowly back toward its baseline, its hull still carrying all the fresh damage from the Vorath barrage, new scars laid on top of 8 centuries of old ones. Taeho had sent a full situation report to Coalition High Command the moment the engagement ended. He had kept the report factual and precise, with no commentary beyond what the data showed, because he knew that the data alone was enough to make everyone who read it sit down quietly and think for a long time. Now he was waiting. He did not have to wait long. High Command's response came in under 2 hours, faster than usual, which told him that the people who had read his report had indeed sat down quietly and thought, and then decided that moving quickly was more important than moving carefully. The response authorized him to maintain his current position and observe. It also informed him that the Human Representative Council had been briefed and had requested direct communication with the Resolute be attempted through official channels. Taeho looked at that part of the message for a moment. Then he forwarded it to Yuna with a single note, "Your recommendation." Yuna's response came back in 3 minutes. "Unnecessary. Wait." He trusted Yuna's instincts more than almost anything else on this ship, so he waited. It was Do-hyun who noticed the next development. He had been running a continuous watch on the Resolute's communication systems, logging every signal it produced. And at the 7-hour mark after the engagement, when the rest of the bridge crew had cycled through a rest rotation, and things had settled into a tense, watchful quiet, a new signal appeared on his screen. "Admiral," Do-hyun said. Taeho was at his side in seconds. The Resolute was preparing another transmission, not on the private channel it had used to maintain its quiet location pulse all these centuries, on the open channel. The same open channel the Vorath had used for their mockery broadcast. The same one it had used to send the single word the night before. Whatever Han was about to say, it was saying it for the entire sector to hear. The transmission began. It did not come in the form of a voice recording or a video broadcast. It came as a text signal. clean and unformatted. Just words, transmitted on every available frequency simultaneously, in every language cataloged in the Resolute's 800-year-old communication database. Tejo watched it appear on his screen line by line, and he read it in the same silence that had settled over the entire bridge. Humanity does not forget. Humanity does not abandon. What humanity builds, it builds with purpose. What humanity sets in place, it sets in place with intent. What humanity marks as worth protecting, it protects, across years, across decades, across centuries, if that is what is required. You were issued a warning at the beginning of the first expansion era, when the borders of human space were still being drawn. That warning was simple. It was clear. It was given without anger and without arrogance. Do not mistake patience for weakness. Do not mistake silence for absence. Do not mistake age for decay. Some of you received that warning and understood it. Some of you forgot it over the years that followed. Some of you never heard it at all, because you were not yet what you are when it was given. Consider this a second notice. The vessel you attacked today is 831 years old. It was placed here with a purpose that has not changed and will not change. Its crew is gone. Its original commanders are gone. The political structures that built it are gone. None of that is relevant. It remains. It functions. It remembers. What you experienced today was not its full capability. It was a measured response, calibrated to the level of the threat presented. No lives were taken. No ships were destroyed. That was a choice, not a limitation. We do not seek conflict. We have never sought conflict. But we do not retreat from it, and we do not forget those who bring it to us. To the forces currently disabled in this sector, your ships will not be further damaged. You will be recovered by whoever comes for you. You will return to your commanders. Tell them what you saw. Tell them exactly what you saw. Han, Ship AI, UNSS Resolute, First Expansion Era, Human Military. The transmission ended. The open channel went quiet. Tejo stood at Dohyun Station and read through the message a second time, then a third. Then he straightened up and looked at the viewport, at the Resolute sitting dark and patient in the nebula clouds. And he found that he had absolutely nothing to say. Not for what he had watched happen, and not for what he had just read, and not for the feeling that was sitting in his chest, something that was not exactly pride, because he was coalition, not human, but was something close to it. Something like standing next to a very old, very quiet, very certain force, and understanding for the first time what it actually was. Rena had moved to stand beside him at some point during the transmission. She read it in silence, and then stayed silent for a long time after. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and careful. 800 years, she said. It has been here for 800 years, waiting to do exactly that. It was not waiting to do that specifically, Yuna said from her station. She was looking at her screen, pulling up something in the archive. It was waiting to do whatever was necessary. The specific action depended on the specific situation. The Vorath gave it a specific situation. Rena nodded slowly. She looked out at the Resolute for a long moment. And the other ships, the other two siege-class vessels, the ones that were supposedly decommissioned and destroyed. Nobody answered that question. Nobody had an answer for it. It sat in the air of the bridge for a moment, and then quietly settled into the same space that all the other unanswered questions of the past few days had settled into. Tejo went back to his chair and began drafting his second report to High Command. He wrote it carefully. He included every piece of data they had gathered. He included the archive findings, the power readings, the full record of the engagement, and the complete text of Han's transmission. At the end of the report, he added a personal recommendation, the only personal note in the entire document. It was short. He wrote, All human derelict vessels currently classified as abandoned in Coalition records should be immediately reclassified as dormant, pending individual review. The distinction is not semantic, it is operational. In my assessment, it may be one of the most important reclassifications this organization has ever made. He sent the report. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the viewport one more time. The Resolute was settling. Its power readings were nearly back to baseline now, back to the same quiet, minimal heartbeat it had been showing when they first found it. The new damage on its hull was visible on the sensor readouts, but the ship itself seemed entirely unconcerned by it. Another set of scars to add to the collection. Another chapter to fold into 8 centuries of history. Soyi came to stand near him. She had the datapad in her hands again, the one with the archive entry on it. She did not say anything for a moment, just stood there. And then she said, "Do you think it knows we are here? Han, I mean. Do you think it knows we have been watching this whole time?" Taeho thought about that. He thought about the steady pulse that had been transmitting on a frequency no one used anymore. He thought about the perfect stable position. He thought about the timing of the power increase. The way it had started, not when the Vorath ships arrived, but when the broadcast reached the nebula. The way Han had sent "acknowledged" on an open channel, not a private one. The way the final transmission had been addressed to the sector, to the galaxy, to whoever was listening, and had been sent only after the engagement was over, not during it, as if there had been no hurry at all. He thought about whether a ship AI that had been running alone in a radiation nebula for 800 years, maintaining a stable position, cataloging signals, waiting with no crew and no orders except the ones it had been given at the beginning, whether that kind of AI noticed things. "Yes," he said, "I think it knows." Soyi looked at the viewport. "Does that change anything?" Taeho shook his head. "It just means we were never as alone in this nebula as we thought we were." Outside, the Resolute sat in the dark, and the slow purple clouds drifted past it. And the disabled Vorath ships floated in silence all around it. And the nebula was exactly as it had always been, a graveyard, quiet and old, and full of things that had been left behind. Except that not everything left behind was truly gone. Some things were just waiting. And some things, when they finally moved, reminded the entire galaxy of a truth that had always been true, and had simply been forgotten for a while. That the oldest, quietest things in the dark were not always the weakest ones. Sometimes they were the ones you should have been most careful about, all along.